lived experience is very much a knowledge building project, and it can be interpreted in lots of different ways. So if we understand the long history of racism and of marginalization within our world and within the entire global system as something that was historically intentional in its exclusion of marginalized people, from theorizing on their lives, from understanding their lives, from building a sort of knowledge base based on their experience, that's where the conversation of lived experience comes from. It comes from this radical kind of tradition of theorizing from a place of marginality, of building knowledge from a place of marginality, with recognition of the exclusion of forms of knowledge that marginalized people were able to create, right? And we also understand that this exclusion was intentional as a dehumanizing project. It was intentional by making the case that only civilizations build knowledge, and those who don't build knowledge are therefore uncivilized, without recognition that people who have resisted, people who have existed as marginalized populations, have always theorized their lives, have always understood the complexities of marginalization, have always tried to understand and use this lens to not only develop understandings of what liberation might mean, but also pushing forward a different form of humanity, a more compassionate form of humanity, a humanity in which everyone is free and everyone is liberated. Now, when we go to the current moment, when we think about how lived experience is oftentimes promoted and talked about, it's seen as this attaché, right? So you have charity organizations, other organizations, all of a sudden concerned with lived experience, all of a sudden concerned with, bringing in someone who has a lived experience of a particular marginality. And I think that the intentions are somewhat good, right, to bring in people who have been traditionally excluded. But the realities of what that process means in an inherently exploitative, in an inherently traumatic, in an inherently marginal and oppressive system is that the radical roots of lived experience, the radical roots of, people who are marginalized, having a sense of agency in developing their own knowledge, in building frameworks and lenses for seeing the multitudes of ways that oppression exists and persists historically and throughout their lives, isn't necessarily what is being done in charities, right? Isn't necessarily what's been done in organizations who are concerned with lived experience. And that's where I want this conversation to think through kind of concrete examples of how lived experience has become so disjointed and so broken and so exploited and so de-radicalized. Lived experience being tied to a creation of knowledge, resistance, creations of kind of communities of solidarity and coalitions who are actively trying to move against an oppressive system, now all of a sudden being about identity, is part and parcel of a lot of what we talk about here, right? How something that is radical becomes so neoliberalized that it becomes individual, becomes personal, it becomes about identity, not in its radical iterations of what identity is, but identity as this sort of fixed essential category that, if we don't know enough about experiences of racial marginalization, we just need to get one person, who has a lived experience of this particular marginality, and all our problems will be fixed. And the ignorance in that statement lays in the fact that there's an assumption that these knowledges don't exist before we hire this person. There's an assumption that the 100 of years of theorization on race, of slave revolts, of, emancipation projects, of liberation projects that are deeply rooted in that framework of lived experience, not just as this sort of intellectual navel-gazing exercise, but an attempt to think through what a new world means, should really, really upset us, right? It should really, really worry us. And that's why I have a lot of caution, especially now when I see the sort of proliferation of so much adverts. And, if you go to, charity job, we're really interested in people with a particular lived experience. The knowledge exists, right? The knowledge is there. There is an intentional ignorance in not transforming a system and instead assuming it's fixed just by hiring policies, assuming it's fixed by just bringing one sort of representative, which ties into the sort of representation politics question too. And that's obviously not the case, right? So we are clear, and we need to be clear that this is not an exercise in transforming when organizations talk about lived experience or wanting someone with lived experience. This is an attempt to plaster on huge, massive cracks. This isn't an attempt to shift and transform a culture of a place, but rather tokenize it, right? But rather, not be bothered to take that extra effort in building a transformative system based on the long histories of knowledges that precede us, and simply, kind of throwing our hands up in the air and just saying, we just don't know enough, so we'll just get a person who's marginalized to tell us what to do. We want people with lived experience, but we're also adding these sorts of, categories of a particular form of experience within a sort of formal capacity, within an institutional capacity, to justify their position, right? Which then makes it not truly about lived experience of building resistance movements outside of traditional sectors, outside of traditional infrastructures and institutions. What we're simply saying, we want someone who has experience of working oftentimes in a racially capitalist, exploitative organization, who just so happens to look marginalized or be someone who has a marginalized identity, because then that justifies our process, right? That justifies the cultures of white supremacy and exploitation that we build and ingrain into our systems, because we'll just get someone who's Black to lead it.
You're setting this person up to fail. If you understood this person's lived experience of oppression rather than the fact that they are Black, then actually the way that you would engage with bringing them into your organization, even would you at all, probably not, would be totally different. And you would have to transform your organization in order for you to even start thinking about bringing in people with lived experience.
Organizations are not interested enough in funding the dreaming process, funding the resistance process, funding the systems that do not look familiar to them to transform, right? You very much want someone who looks a particular way, but is absolutely wedded to keeping systems and structures the same into your institutions. And then on the flip side of that, speaking to this identity point, when that isn't the mechanism through which people with lived experience enter an organization, what then happens is that being a marginalized identity becomes a category through which we want trauma to be performed for us, right? Where we will bring someone in who has a disability to perform their trauma, to tell us about their trauma, so we can feel better about ourselves for including them in an inherently exploitative and extractive system. The truth of the matter is we see time and time again how in this kind of neoliberal moment, language, thought, processes that are attempting to be transformative, are attempting to do something inherently radical, become rendered utterly meaningless, become rendered anything but the thing that they initially sought to represent.